Chapter 13.
He had no faith!
Holly said it like he still couldn't believe it was true. He looked at me with all the wide-eyed incredulity of a child learning for the first time that fair has nothing to do with the real world. Shocked, hurt, more than a little frightened, angry too, and morally indignant, demanding an explanation. I had none. None anyway that would do any good to him right then, so I changed the subject. I thought you said you couldn't read the guy's mind.
I couldn't. Not really, I mean. I couldn't tell when he was going to move until he moved, or what he was going to say until he said it, but I felt it when it happened. It was so close, so intimate.
You mean emotions? I persisted. You could read those?
Not read them, he replied carefully. Feel them. Or rather, feel him feeling them.
I glanced across the bed to Laya for some reaction. No luck. She sat as she had for the entire hour I had been there, hunched forward in her chair, with her elbow propped up on a knee, her chin propped in her palm, and her eyes staring dead blank at the floor. The only signs of animation came when she put out one cigarette in order to light another. But she was listening. Her face was drawn so tightly across her cheeks it looked like it should hurt. I shifted back to Holly, looking skinny and out of place against the vast expanse of linen. Even his bedclothes dwarfed him, ignoring all but his broadest gestures. He was constantly having to drag his huge collar around to match the motions of his neck. There was a lot of motion there. His eyes darted constantly about the room, from the ceiling to the walls, to Laya to me, and back again, pausing only when he had trouble choosing the right words. Then he would stare at the palms of both hands held plaintively before his face like twin view screens, and his eyes would glaze, and he would be back there, in the suit, in the war. It was particularly eerie. He wasn't away long this time. He dropped his hands on his lap.
He had no faith,
he said again, the same way as before. I nodded, exactly as if I had any notion whatsoever. Well, I've got to run, I lied, standing up. See you tomorrow, Holly. Laya? Something in my unease must have leaked through. Holly looked up at me this time for the first time. No, Jack, he glanced at Laya.
Tonight. Can you come back tonight?
I noticed Laya watching me too. I nodded. Tonight it is, I said, and scooted too quickly out the door. I hurried through the seals outside where the sun was shining and the sky was earth blue and lovely, where there were horses and cattle things on the meadows surrounding the western edge of the dome. The guards on the bridge smiled at me and waved and said something unintelligible but nice. I took all of this in and relished it, filled my lungs with it. Got all the way across the bridge, sat down at the far end of it, and got my cigarette lit before I let myself think. On the other hand, I told myself furiously, Holly could be simply stunned, instead of the vegetable he appeared to be, or maybe he was just stark raving mad, an improvement over being a carrot anyway. Shit. Or maybe it was just my usual guilt funk dripping those pitiful images. I made a command decision. I decided to forget about it. Holly was just tired out and a little disillusioned, that was all, by the reality of war versus the flag waving. Okay? Okay. Besides, I was busy with trader business. I had to see Weiss. I walked over the sewer bridge into the city. It was its usual teeming, desperate self. People stomped or strolled or wandered about looking for spots to hide what little bits of their past lives they had dragged through the staggering jolt of getting this far. The maze was dry now, but miserably pockmarked with hundreds of hard and dusty footprint craters. I limped and tripped alongside everybody else on my way to Weiss's passage. I was about halfway up the gradually ascending length of it in about 1/10 of the time it had taken me before in the rain and darkness and despair. It was more than just the physical conditions which made this day different, however. There seemed to be a new touch of something in the air, crisp and clean and hopeful, maybe? The way the people clamored about, like the rain had washed something away and what was left was good and purposeful and so, feeling poetic and the like, I got a little careless. A guy came suddenly hopping out of a narrow side tunnel, moaning in pain and fluttering his right hand in the air. Damn, 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 he said to himself, and then, apparently seeing that he wasn't alone, to me. Then he stopped his hopping long enough to hold his left thumb up and examine it critically. It was purple and, I assumed, it was swelling.
Can you believe it? He asked. This is the 4th damn time.
I smiled, partly because of the way I was feeling and partly because of the way the guy was. Nice-looking man, big, broad-shouldered, with long black hair that was maned, squared off around his forehead. He was Oriental, Earth Orient, that is. He had an easy, powerful voice. Seems like it, I agreed pleasantly. My dumbass helper, he added, with a shrug in the direction from which he had appeared. Idiot has no grip whatsoever. He shook his head and sucked briefly on the purple digit. He grimaced slightly. I shrugged consolingly, made a step past him.
Hey,
he said, brightening.
Can you give me a hand?
It'll just take a second. Just help Idiot hold it in place long enough so that I can... And blah, 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 with me following him around the corner, and sure enough, there was a corner of one of the local throw-togethers exposed with this huge piece of what looked like plasteel heat shielding resting beside it that looked to have been carved out to fit the hole. Up above on the 2nd story was this little guy with red hair, the Idiot, no doubt, leaning out of what had once been an escape hatch back during the time when this erector set used to be a starship. And it looked all right. The redhead was in a good position to hold the piece of plasteel if he leaned out the hatch, while the Oriental on the ground could brad it in tight. So I nodded and stepped forward, and the Oriental picked up one side, and I reached for the other, and the redhead stretched both arms down to get it, and then I noticed that it wasn't really plasteel at all. It was that plastoform crap that was so popular because it was cheap and looked like plasteel, and I thought, well, hell, he ought to be able to just hold this with one hand. And that's when the Oriental hit me. He was a big guy, and it was a damn good blow. A forearm to the side of my head. I went down flat. Then rolling away into position for the next shot, and then there was red hair flying through the air onto me out the hatch, and he hit me as hard as the local gravity allowed for his fall, which was plenty. And before I could get a good grip on him or the Oriental who loomed over me or anything else, the sun was blotted out by many others crowding in for a piece. The crowd worked well enough, each getting a good grip on me and lifting me up off the ground, making me helpless and, worse, making me know it. They hustled me around a corner and then around a couple others, the passage getting narrower and narrower until we stopped in this tight, square, claustrophobic little area surrounded on 3 sides by 3 stories of maze, crooked and ugly and seeming to lean in on us. They had me. Absolutely goddamn had me. No one broke his concentration or loosened his grip or looked like he was going to. 2 on each leg, 2 on each arm. One held the back of my head against his chest with 2 huge hands, the thumb on the left one painted purple. Shit. Shit because they had me, really had me. And I hated, loathed, was repulsed, sickened by having hands on me without my consent. And double shit, because I had been so utterly fooled and, come to think of it, triple shit. Because not only did this group know how to handle itself against an enemy, they knew how to handle themselves against me. This wasn't a shakedown or a robbery or any other sort of thug-mugging gang. This was the execution of a plan dreamed up by someone who used well-trained, or at least well-drilled, disciplined people who knew just how good I was and who weren't taking any chances. "Bring him here," said somebody I couldn't see, and they did. All 18 legs of them spiraled around so that I might face the man who had spoken. He stood on a jutting piece of web form a couple of meters over our heads. He looked about 50, which meant nothing, of course. Still, I had the impression that his appearance was natural, non-cosmetic, which would have made him a couple of decades younger than me. But I only noticed those details in passing, the way I noticed his well-worn tunic and his beard and the unusually long, thin fingers on the hands hanging clasped before him. For beside him stood eyes, clean now and amongst her folk, safe. Long brown hair tucked into something functional, legging things on the legs of her pants, simple tunic like her father's. Was it her father who stood at her side? I never found out. She looked strong and capable and lovely and well worth the fighting that had gone on for her sake. Still eyes, too. Hers shone in the sun. "You must forgive us," began their leader, opening his hands in an expression of regret, "for having treated you this fashion. But your somewhat lethal reputation has preceded you." "Is that supposed to be an apology?" I snarled. "It is." "That the best you can do?" He stiffened. So, in fact, did a couple of the ones holding me. Eyes, I noticed, showed no reaction at all. She was still waiting. "I assume," he began again, "that your statement implies release." He paused, wiped his brow clear of a lock of sandy gray hair with one of those long fingers. "Quite understandable, of course," he resumed. "Even reasonable, under normal circumstances." Those hands clasped together again, and he peered forcefully into my eyes. "You, sir, are hardly normal circumstances, even for us. If I were to have you set free, how many of your captors would be killed or maimed or otherwise handicapped before they could get free?" I grinned, shrugged. 3. He nodded. "At least 3, Mr. Crow. At least." His hands separated again, palms upward. "So you see how my hands are tied." I laughed. I had to. So, apparently, did everyone else, at the absurdity of the situation, and at our own, each and every one of us. So bizarre. So often. Eyes, sparkling. Laughed herself beautiful. I forced my thoughts and my feelings and me away from the idea of that. The leader had resumed. "Do hope you won't be too uncomfortable while I say what little I have to say. In any case, Get on with it," I snapped, hating buddy-buddy while being held. That cooled him off instantly. We all got a lot more tense. The muscles on the hands that held me grew more taut. Good. This was not fun, damn it. "Very well, Mr. Crow," said the leader stiffly. "I shall indeed get on with it. First, let me tell you a little bit about who we are." He spread his hands wide to indicate not just the immediate throng, but the city itself. And then he gave a speech. It was a pretty good one, and he didn't ease up much either. He really did tell me who they were, and what. They were crewmen and women from the starships, or couples with girls and boys of draft age, or merchants fleeing the growing restriction of wartime. They were societies against the loss of something or other. They were people who had pushed off into the unknown, one step ahead of fleet expansion, or 2 steps ahead of prison. They fled the loss of freedom, the courts, their wives or husbands, their past. Most simply fled the Ant War. Quite a few more were deserters. Each had, or had been, deserted. So they crashed their shuttlecraft in the gorge, or entire ships along the flatlands under the shale bluffs. Sometimes they left their empty ships in orbit, sometimes the same orbit. The rare night flashes of colliding bulkheads were the sources of much amusement, as well as a small monthly lottery. Many died. Many had lived, though, and those folk hung together. Raw and bleeding and desperate, they tacked the tortured metal together and hammered at the bulkheads and welded and strained and fought and lived. Their hulls became outer walls. Airlocks became doors. First 1 battered ship became 2 battered ships, and then 3, and then 4. Beside it, another equally ugly configuration began to grow the same way, and then another, and another. The first clearing opened into another outer one, and so on, until they had formed the maze. The maze! The maze of dirty, heat-blasted metal and plasteel through which trod an ever-growing horde. The streets were almost always muddy, so usually were the people. Primitive hydroponics kept them alive. Then came other things, and though they were never fully organized in any formal sense, bosses had appeared to make the attempt. The tough guys didn't last long. They rose up and seized control for a while until stabbed or blazed or beaten to death by one-time clerical assistants or pharmacists or third-class drive techs who had come a long way to be rid of such men and would damn well not accept them now. There were major setbacks and major villains, but each and all were vanquished, trod into the mud of the maze by a deeper, mightier vitality that came from desperation and the will to live. Soon, it was just a naked force bigger than the sum of its parts, bigger and stronger, and somehow more mature, ready, at last, to evolve into something else. A city. And then, I said, interrupting, came Weiss. The leader broke off his rhetoric and eyed me narrowly. After a moment, he nodded. Yes, he said, Weiss, and his band of animals. And now the whole process has begun all over again, I snorted. The people seemed behind him on the bridge a few weeks back, against the project director, no less. The people don't understand him. They don't know what he is. They don't see what you want them to see. There was a murmur of anger through the bunch holding me. A couple of them increased the intensity of their grips. Even the leader was affected. His poise busted at last. Weiss and his crew are a band of cutthroats and hoodlums who would do anything to take control and hold it. Anything. He stared angrily at me for several seconds before resuming. We know that you know Weiss, that you have dealings with him, but we had hoped that, from what we had heard about you in the past and from... He glanced briefly at Eyes. And from other sources, that you were not the type of man to be helping such a brigand. Not if we could make you see what he was. If you only knew. If I only knew! I shouted, appalled. If I only cared, you mean? That froze him. He started to speak, stopped. He looked suddenly unsure, uprooted. He stared at me. But if... What do you... Finish this, I barked. One way or the other. He continued to stare at me a long time. No one else. The rest couldn't look. They looked away. But the leader seemed welded to me. Damn it. I knew what he was about. It made sense. Borglin gave me a ship. Weiss would hardly throw in for free. But who the hell was I to cut out his piece? I didn't blame this man. I didn't blame him or Eyes or his people. I wouldn't have stood for it either. They were right to oppose this sort of bullying. But, god damn it, that didn't mean they were right. He broke the gaze at last. He looked at his feet. The long fingers intertwined, writhing incestuously. He looked pale and pitiful and... Damn him! Let him go, he said. They did. Reluctantly, then warily, then carefully. I made no moves when they set me down. I even gave them a chance to back away before standing. The leader hadn't moved. I looked at Eyes, saw she had gone. They were just eyes now. But when she saw me looking at her, they returned. In anger and disgust, her eyes became eyes once more. And I knew why they had affected me so. I saw the dreams in them then, the rightness, and, more importantly, the conviction. The willingness about the necessary risks, her life on the line. But I had already made all those decisions, damn it! I wanted my ship! Gradually, I became aware of movement all around me. I turned my head to see that everyone was leaving. The leader had already gone. Soon, there were only the two of us left there, staring at one another, and soon after that, only me. But not soon enough. For before she left, she said, in a way I refused to recall, "So you're Jack Crow." Then she spat, and then she left. I wanted to kill her. I just stood there. It took me half an hour to find out that the passage I had chosen to lead me out was a dead end. I kicked the web of thermoflex blocking my path with a vengeance. I could have killed her then. I sighed, suddenly exhausted by my own anger, by the burdensome weight of it. A perfect day, I muttered, and turned back around. It took me another half an hour to reach the square once more. Only then could I think about finding Weiss's lair. His office had been straightened up somewhat, but he was the same old charmer. "What did you tell them?" he asked without preamble as I stepped through the door. "Fuck off," I replied evenly. "Is that a direct quote?" asked an unmistakably powerful voice from behind me. "Or simply more evidence of your sparkling personality?" I spun on my heel and faced Borglin, momentarily stunned once more by the sheer enormity of him, of a real giant. "Both!" I snapped, gathering together quickly, as I always seemed to do in a pinch, my worst side. Borglin ignored my response, as he could well afford to. He motioned me to a chair and stood over me and talked strategy. And when the question came about the dome defense screens, I could have lied, said that it couldn't be done. I could have simply turned the question aside, as I had before with Weiss. But I didn't. "It's done," I replied. "They're helpless." Borglin didn't stay much longer than that, just enough to thank me for what I had done so far and to reiterate what Weiss had said about the uncertain timetable. He thought a couple of more weeks, but he couldn't be any more definite than that. Then he left. And why not? There was no need to stick around. He had what he wanted. He had gotten my assurance about the screens, and I had gotten the point of his being there, which was the knowledge that he could be there any time. On the way back to the project, I thought about what it had been like to have been hung in the air by those fat fingers of his. I bristled. both at the remembered feeling of frustration and at the knowledge that it was just what Borglin would want me to think about.